This video is going to be about speed painting, and specifically we're going to speed paint some robots, droids. Necron Warriors is what I will be painting, but it could be any kind of metallic based miniature, specifically sort of robot or droid. So speed painting is basically about getting things done fast, I guess, to get it on the table, to be able to game with your miniatures. And therefore, you know, I find speed painting is a little bit difficult to talk about because whatever is speed is very individual. So in this video, I'm going to have a bit of a roadmap. I'm going to keep on going, and it's going to get more advanced the further I go. But there's sort of, you know, depending on where you are satisfied with the result, you can sort of stop and be happy with that. So back to my Necron Warriors. I just have to say that they look cool. They look really sort of robot-y, but the mold lines and I feel really sorry for you out there that are working on a Necron army. Sorry guys and girls. But our first step after assembling and trying to sort out mold lines is to zenithal prime. This is a very important step in this speed painting process. It's basically what the entire thing is based around. If you don't know about zenithal priming, it's basically the most typical method is you spray paint either with a rattle can or with an airbrush your entire miniature with a black, and then you dust it with a white after the black is dried, sort of from above and a little bit from the sides, and that sort of paint dust will land on your miniature roughly from where there would have been a sky. So it looks like your miniature is has light shining on it from an imaginary sky. That's why it's called zenithal priming, because when the sun is straight up, it's in a zenith, and hence zenithal priming. But that's the most typical approach, black with a white. For our purpose, we're not going to be using a white, we're going to be using a metallic. Specifically for these Necrons, I first coated them with the Chaos Black, and then dusted them from up top and a little bit on the sides with this army painter, chain plate metal, I believe it's called. And this zenithal priming is what's going to be the base for the rest of this video. So it's a really important step. And I want to mention with the zenithal priming is that you can it's up to you how sort of bright you want the miniature. You start with the black, obviously. But after that, the more of the metal, specifically in this case, I recommend sort of a darker metal, sort of like a gunmetal, or, you know, because this is it's called not gunmetal, it's called chain plate, whatever. But it's fairly dark. It's not like a chrome or an aluminium. And that's quite important as well. You want a pretty dark metal. But I was saying, I mean, you can aim. The more of this you use, the less shadows you get. If you just dust sort of a bit from up top and maybe just right sort of in front of them, then you get the backs a bit more dark, which is sort of what I did because it looks kind of cool. If you're not certain of sort of how you should be going about it, just take one of them and practice. If you don't really like that, take another one and practice until you go like, wow, this, you know, he's a bit darker on one side, and, you know, it's a good place to start. I do want to mention as well, I know I'm mentioning a lot of things sort of here initially, but that's just the way I am. By the way, if you're not, welcome to 52 Miniatures. And if you're new to this channel, it's mainly about me trying things out for the first time or maybe for the second time, but I'm by no means an expert. And this technique that we're working on now is sort of something I've sort of stumbled upon and I like. But yeah, anyway, back to the miniatures. We're using metallic, sort of iron, you know. This could be a gold, This could be a bronze, it could be a green metallic, you know, what if it doesn't necessarily have to be this exact paint. If you're going for like, I want my droids to be golden, do exactly the same thing. Black first, and then use a gold spray rattled can, you know? Now I'm going to be timing this entire speed painting process, but I didn't time the zenithal priming because it's not really fair. Because in theory, you could be doing this to 50 models at the same time, or you could be doing it to one, and it pretty much takes the same amount of time. Not really, but almost. Like spray painting isn't really all that time consuming. So I've left that out of the equation. Also, I mention rattle cans a lot. If you do have an airbrush, please go ahead and use that, you know. I don't have one, so I use rattle cans. Outdoors, please, and shake them well. So this is what the first step looks like. It's a metallic droid. And you know how I was saying about a roadmap? Well, if you're really not bothered, you know, you could just finish off the base and be done with it. I know this is really fast, but you know, if you really aren't bothered, you know, at least you've got some paint on your miniature. And yeah, but I'm not going to stop here. I'm going to keep on going. Just regarding speed painting, one of the big tricks I think with speed painting is doing a lot more miniatures at the same time, because you're doing it in steps, and for every step, if you do it a lot of times, you get better and you get faster at it. And one way of working, I've made a video about chain rasp horde speed painting, which didn't really turn out to be painting them very fast. But in that video, I used this thing, which I just built it, and you can put 5 miniatures on it at the same time. And so when you paint, you can do exactly the same thing on that one, on that one, on that one, and so forth. Turn them around, you know. It's a very efficient way of working when you speed paint. For my case in this video, because I'm doing different versions, because of the roadmap, I did them one at a time, more kind of a thing. But this is really efficient. So the next step is to add some highlights to our zenithal priming. That's why I wanted to use sort of a darker metallic spray for the zenithal priming, is to be able to add more precise highlights on top of that. I've been using this, I strongly can, if you're into metallic paints, I can strongly recommend these, even if you don't have an airbrush. They're called airbrush metallics, airbrush acrylic metal color airbrush colors from Vallejo. They're real fine, yeah? This is aluminium. It was the brightest one I could find, and that's what, you know, if you're trying this as well, try and find your brightest metallic for these highlights. There's a couple of different ways of highlighting. I tried them all out so you can see the result. One is dry brushing. Basically, if you don't know what dry brushing is you dip fairly sort of, companies make specific dry brushes, but you cannot use an old brush. Dip it in paint, wipe most of the paint off on a piece of tissue, and then sort of rub the brush lightly against your miniature. Thus, all the paint on your brush only sticks to sort of whatever's raised from the miniature. Another way of highlighting is actually painting the highlights on there. So sort of like edge highlighting, just painting layers. So I tried that as well. And it's a lot more time consuming. It's not really speed painting, and, you know, but it still kind of sort of looks better, because there's areas on these miniatures that where the dry brush just sort of, it does too much. Whereas with painting the highlights on there, you can be more specific. But the dry brush, you know, it just took like 2 to 3 minutes, whereas painting the highlights on there took, you know, 7 to 8 minutes. And so I opted for a middle ground, which was doing a little bit of both. I dry brushed just lightly sort of lifting the highlights a little bit. And then where I wanted to really make a point, it's sort of on the arms, sort of the nice sort of lines going down on the legs, a little bit in the face. I painted that on. And so by using this sort of combined technique, which was actually gave me the most pleasing result, I also sort of shaved down the time to about 5 minutes per miniature. What, you're done already? Next step is the details, and this is really up to you how much details you want to paint on and how well you want to do them. I mean, that's the thing of speed painting. It's about cutting corners and, you know, how nice do you want the miniature to look. For the hose thing on the weapon, which is what I started with, I used a livery green Vallejo game color and just did a quick wet blend with this flat yellow Vallejo model color. A wet blend is basically if you take a lot of this, smudge it on, and while that's still wet, try and wiggle some of this yellow into it in the middle, and you sort of get a gradient, and it looks like sort of, you know, there's some strange gun power energy kind of a thing flowing through there. And then for the sort of spidery looking insignia on the chest, I just used this livery green. And, you know, this could be the next place to sort of jump off the bandwagon and go, this looks fine. I'll just finish the base and I'm done. Oh, and I also dotted some white and then green in the eyes. You know, if you choose to stop here, then we're roughly up to about 10 minutes for a miniature. And by the way, at the end of this video, there is going to be a quick basing tip on sort of how to make a really quick base that looks all right. But if you want to keep on going, then, you know, this is some examples of what I did. And this is a really bad example because I actually forgot to press record while I painted this stage. But I painted some ink on the miniature. It's from Formula P3. I mixed blue and green ink, and I painted it because, you know, it's see-through. So I painted it a little bit under the eyes, a little bit on the weapon, and, you know, you'll see it in the coming footage that, you know, wherever it looks sort of dark green, that's the ink. And then I went in after the ink and, you know, painted details with the livery green again. So, you know, same as on the previous miniature, it's the spidery insignia on the chest, but also some more details on the weapon, and also sort of a glowing kind of a thing going under the eyes. Still very sort of trying to work fast, but just getting a little bit more detail going. After that, I used this contrast paint. Oh dear, it's not shut properly. Athematic blue from Citadel, contrast paint, on sort of the entire weapon, giving it sort of a bluish, greenish kind of a tone. With these greens and the blues and everything that I've picked out, I mean, I'm going a little bit for the look of on the cover, but if you're painting some other kind of a droid, it could be completely different colors. You just change them out. You know, it doesn't have to be green. And, you know, if you don't like this contrast paint on the gun, you could use a black wash, or, you know, if you want to I just wanted to add the gun a little bit more of something. This is more about the principle of showing you how to get things done relatively fast. Okay. Now another 10 minutes have passed. And this could be a great place to stop as well. What, you're already done? Oh, here goes another one. But if you want to take this just one step further, still working fast, I've got one last sort of step to show you. And I've touched this subject briefly in a previous video. and it's using oil paints. We're going to be using oil paints to add some character to this robot. I basically squeezed out a bunch of these oil paints. There's a green, there's a purple, there's a blue, there's a sort of orange, red, and a dark brown onto just some waste plastic for my palette. And what I'm going to be doing with this is adding shades and just some more color tones going in the metal itself. With oil paints, it doesn't, it doesn't bond, it doesn't interfere with the acrylic paints underneath. So whatever I'm doing here with these oil paints, basically I can wash it off with white spirit. That's the thing with oil paints. They're oil-based, and if you want to dilute them, or if you want to clean your brush, or if you want to, do whatever, you need white spirit. And so please, if you start using oil paints and start using white spirit and things like that, have in mind that it's not water, it's a chemical. And if you have kids around the house and things like that, maybe you need to step up your sort of, what are you leaving on your game table, hobby space table, things like that. If you think white spirit smells too much to be painting at home, there's other options. Here's something called sans odor, pardon my French, which is basically sort of like white spirit, only it doesn't smell. It's still a chemical that you can get I don't know if you can see it, there's a person here whose chest is sort of exploding. It's if you drink it, you get chemical pneumonia. Yeah, you shouldn't be drinking white spirit. Yeah, so just have a bit more thought to sort of your safety process when using oil paints, but that's the small thing. The big thing is this is gonna turn out awesome. Now all these oil paints are fairly dark, so basically what I'm doing is I'm taking some colors from my palette and painting them on heavily in sort of the shaded areas. I'm using mainly the blue and the green, but there's some brown and some of the orange here and there as well. I have no sort of sense of logic, or maybe not even purpose to this, but I just smear it on. And once I've, the thing with oil paints is they don't dry fast at all, so you don't have to rush this. It's not like using acrylics. You paint it on, and then once you've got it in all the shaded places, I clean my brush out and have a little bit of white spirit on it, not too much, but sort of dip it in white spirit, wipe it off a little bit on a piece of paper, and just sort of start cleaning up and adding gradients, which is really easy with oil paints. So basically, cleaning up all the highlights, leaving the oil paint in the shadows, trying to leave some here and there sort of in a gradient sort of manner, i.e. going from the darkest to, or from lots of oil paint to no oil paint, but in a longer gradient, not just a sharp line. Now this is sort of like using a wash, only with a lot more control, and you have a lot more time if you want. I know this is speed painting, but it doesn't dry very fast, so that you can sort of smudge these gradients out, which by the way is really simple, and I think the result is stunning. If we compare the sort of the guy who just left and said he didn't want to do oil paints, it takes too much time. Here we can compare to his mini and to the oil painted mini. And you can see that the one with the oil paint on it is just, it's got a lot more character going. And this is not, it's not super fast, but it's not a slow process. This is a maximum of another 10 minutes. And once more, that's just me doing it on the one. If I would have had this thing up with 5 on there, smear on the oil paint, going with the white spirit, it's difficult to see that it would be more than 5 minutes per mini. Now we can compare the 10-minute versus the 30-minute. So it's the first sort of just the layer painting, dry brushing kind of a thing, a little bit of green details, to the full-on 30-minute with oil paints and all of it. And also the 20-minute versus the 30 minutes. So the only difference between the 20 and the 30 is the oil paint. but I reckon that the difference is pretty large. And I reckon the one with the oil paint on, at least me personally, is looking really nice. And now for a fast basing trick. And when I say fast, it's, you know, the actual time working on it. It does take longer to dry. This sort of goes for, well, not all of the steps. That would be lying. But, you know, I've timed the amount of time I put into working on the miniature. I haven't timed myself taking coffee or waiting for paint to dry, and you know, and this totally depends on how many miniatures you're working on. If you've got an army of 50 robots, then, you know, the first one will be dry when you're done with the last one. Yeah. Anyway, sorry. Basing. I covered the base first with just the one layer of heavy red from it's a Vallejo game color. Love it. And then I'm going to use Crackle Medium. I've got this Mojave Mud Crack from Green Stuff World. But to make sure that this sticks properly, I actually painted on the one layer of white glue first. And then on top of the white glue, I put an obscene amount of crackle paint on it, almost so that it feels like it's gonna pour over the edges. You know, this takes time to dry. I think this was the last step I did for the day, and then I left it and came back to it the day after, because the crackle paint takes a fair time to dry. So if you're planning this and you want to use this technique, then, you know, don't expect to be able to start doing the next steps immediately after you put the crackle paint on, you know. If you're wondering a bit more like why the white glue and what do you mean with, well, you know, when this shrinks and cracks, it's kind of common that the flakes will fall off, and I just don't want that to happen. So therefore, the white glue. Once this was all dry and crackled, I used some stone gray for just a quick sort of dry brush. And, you know, this is all I did was just the crackle paint. Obviously, you can, if you would have glued a skull or, you know, something like that on there, obviously it'll look nicer. I just did plain, you know, cracked earth. After the dry brush, I used obscene amounts of this Vallejo pigment called dark red ochre, making sure I get it into the cracks so that, you know, it looks darker in the cracks, but also making sure I get quite a fair amount on the legs of the miniature. Like they're standing in this sort of dusty desert and they've got some red dust on their legs. And this looks really effective, especially since they're pretty, you know, they're pretty dark down on the legs. So this really sort of shows and looks really nice. And for pigments, if you use pigments, I can't link to the same, you know, this doesn't work, can't do it for the same video twice. But the one I was talking about earlier, about me introducing oil paints, I also introduced pigments. So if you want to see just a little bit more of how pigments work, you can check that out. But basically to make this sort of stick to the miniature a little bit, once you've got all that red powder on there, you can just drip some white spirit on there and it'll sort of stick to the miniature just a little bit. But you are going to need to varnish the miniature to get this to stick properly. But I figured that sort of goes for the crackle paint as well. So, you know, my final step was, you know, paint the rim of the base, you know, and then varnish the miniature. And then obviously glue the little, they've got these shiny plastic things that go into their guns. It was the last thing I glued on there. But now you're done. And that was the fast basing trick. I think it's about 2 to 3 minutes of actual working time to finish that base. It takes long to dry, obviously. But, you know, it's not all that much effort for a reasonably decent base. And that's, you know, a few different ways based on the same sort of zenithal prime principle. You know, ways to speed paint metallic miniatures, in this case, droids. I'm gonna jabber on for just a little bit about the speed painting. I mean, basically, speed painting, for one thing, it's, as I said earlier, it's individual. It's taking something to a level that you find acceptable to as little a time as possible. So it's all relative. I've tried to show you some shortcuts, well, not shortcuts, but different routes of the roadmap, depending on sort of levels. But you've also seen what adding those, you know, a few 10 minutes here and there per miniature can actually do to the result. But speed painting otherwise, I mean, apart from it being your level, it's about cutting corners. You know, do I really need to do this? How can I do this faster? But also, I think, essentially, the more of the same miniature or same type of miniature you paint in the one batch, the faster it'll go. Like, especially if you do them sort of in an assembly line process like this. But it's also like when you're doing the same thing, say you're doing the edge highlights, when you're on miniature number 15, you're going to be real good at it and it's going to go faster. So my times are, you know, I just did them sort of, in total there's 5, but I was still doing them sort of one at a time and, you know, filming for the video. So I think you could shorten my times quite a bit if you're doing a lot of these. I hope you found this video helpful. Please go ahead, ask me questions in the comments. If you really like the content on this channel, you can support me on Discord, which is new. The link to my Discord is down not in the comments, but, you know, just about above the comments. There's a section with the text and yeah. And thanks for watching. Bye.